Colorado, I do believe, is bowl game bound this year. Now, Deion has flipped the roster again. Hello and welcome to Always College Football. I'm your host, Greg McElroy. Today is Thursday, August 1st, and we appreciate you guys being here wherever it is that you consume the show. We're grateful for all of you that have come in our direction on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcast platforms, the ESPN YouTube channel, and those of us that have started to kind of be with the show for a while. We've kind of hinted at some things that were coming. We are officially on ESPN2 today. That's right. You'll be able to get your dose of Always College Football regularly on ESPN2 throughout the college football season. So we're very grateful to make our debut today here on August 1st. Check it out. Record it. I don't know. Do they still have TiVo? Did TiVo it, record it, DVR it, whatever, stream it. I don't care. Whatever you got to do, get those numbers up and continue to tell your friends. Your word of mouth is huge. We don't have some massive marketing budget. Just me and a couple buddies talking college football. So we appreciate all of you guys that have helped us grow up to this point. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. We've made it to August, and there's football to be played here within the calendar month. Lots to look forward to. Can't wait. Fired up. Just a few weeks away from week 0. Several teams are already in camp. So we want to put a bow on our tiers saga, if you will. We've done the Big Ten, we've done the ACC, and we've done the SEC, but today is the day for the Big 12. Plus, we're also going to dive into our mailbag. A lot of big questions coming in to our mailbags. We want to make sure we get to those as well. So let's dive in. It's the tiers here in the Big 12. We'll kick things off at the top of the Big 12 with Tier 1 teams. Those are national championship contenders. There are none in this league. With all due respect to the Utah Utes and the Kansas State Wildcats and the Kansas Jayhawks and the Oklahoma State Cowboys, I think there's a lot of teams in this league that can get to the college football playoff. I just don't think there are any that can win the national championship. I think the gap that currently exists between the Big 12 and that of the Big 10, SEC, even the top end of the ACC, I think there is a gap there. But like I said, I think there's a bunch that fit into Tier 2, which we qualify as college football playoff contenders. We'll start with the Utah Utes. Now, Utah has won the Pac-12 multiple times, been to a couple Rose Bowls, won it in 21, killed USC for a repeat title in 22, and a bunch of folks were coming back last year, had them in the top 10 in the preseason, and then they had one of the worst injury seasons that I've ever seen in my time as a college football analyst. According to experts that follow the Utes, 157 games were missed by starters and backups in the 2-deep. That is absurd. Most notable, though, are the 13 games missed by starting quarterback from the 2 years prior in Cam Rising. He's back. There's no bigger addition in the Big 12 than the addition of Cam Rising back onto the quarterback spot for the Utes. He's obviously won the Pac-12 a couple times. He's really athletic. He's bulked up this offseason to 225 pounds, so he's a physical runner that can withstand the load of the quarterback run game they certainly want to utilize. We know that there were things about his game that weren't quite ready last year. There were moments where you thought he'd be ready to go, but the ACL injury from the Rose Bowl 2 years ago was just too much for him to be able to overcome. They missed him a lot. They went with a bunch of different guys at quarterback, and it never really was anywhere near what Cam Rising was last year. The wide receiver group has been a group for a while that really hasn't been up to the same tiers as some of the other championship contenders in the sport. That's not really the case anymore. And if you listen to Kyle Whittingham, his willingness to go to the portal and go and get a bunch of guys at that position, most notably Dorian Singer from USC. He was a star at Arizona a couple years ago, actually led the Pac-12 with over 1,100 yards. So this is probably the best receiver room that Utah's ever had. It's deep. It's versatile and super experienced. You also bring back great tight ends. They've had that for a while. Brant Keithy's back. He was out all of last year as well. So Rising's got a ton of weapons at his disposal to become a little bit more balanced in the passing game. Defensively, they returned 70% of their production, partly because they had so many guys miss time last year. Tons of injuries led to guys that were freshmen and sophomores playing early, probably before they were ready, but now they're seasoned and they're prepared to take the next step. Had the 12-team playoff been in existence in the last 20 or some odd years, they would have obviously made it during their undefeated seasons of 2004 and 2008. Those two teams would have, without question, made the playoff. I think that 2004 team could have maybe won the whole thing. I really believe that. 2019 team would have gotten in as an at-large. 2021 and 2022 would have both gotten in with the first-round bye because they won the Pac-12. So this has been a team that's been close. I think they break through this year potentially if they can win the new Big 12. Their schedule's manageable. At Oklahoma State, Arizona comes to them. Iowa State comes to them. But all things considered, things set up really nicely as Utah transitions to the new league. Let's go next to Kansas State, team that's won the Big 12 here in recent years. If you look at their 2-year record, really solid, the best among all 16 programs, 9-4 last year. The thing that's funny about last year is there were moments where it's like, man, Kansas State's playing good ball, but they just couldn't win close games. They were 1-4 in one-score games. But now a lot of people super optimistic with what they have at the quarterback spot. Avery Johnson burst onto the scene last year with a breakout win against Texas Tech. And there were times you watched him, the guy was flat out unstoppable. Then you look at his development and some of the things that you saw as the season went along. Of course, had a bowl game and a start. There were some pretty impressive throws that he was able to execute. So there's probably more in the tank for Avery Johnson. And it feels like the sky's the limit for that young man. I wouldn't be surprised if after Cam Rising and Shedeur Sanders and some of the other quarterbacks in this league, Avery Johnson by season's end might be at or near the top amongst some of the best in the league. Also have some really good backs in the backfield. Giddens is excellent. The biggest question mark is along the offensive line. The good news is the offensive line has always been pretty good. And even though they lost a bunch of really good players, a legend in Cooper Beebe, they might regress some, but the program has a long track record of being rock solid along both lines of scrimmage. Defensively, the starting lineup doesn't have a bunch of guys that are going to be on preseason All-American lists. They don't have a bunch of guys that you're going to recognize based on what they've done statistically, but they're solid. And they are very solid. There hasn't been a ton of guys there traditionally that could back up with great depth, but they've done, I think, a pretty good job of addressing that and developing some homegrown talent and recruiting some like-minded guys in the portal. The schedule's interesting. At Tulane, Arizona, that game's a non-conference game. Oklahoma State comes to them. They're at West Virginia. Kansas comes to them, and they go to Iowa State. So looking at that, things are challenging. I don't think they can get through it unscathed. But I think a 10-2, 9-3 is very much within reach for Kansas State. We'll go next to the Pokes of Oklahoma State. Last year in September, I'm not sure anyone knew what to expect. It was one of the most up and down seasons that I can recall, with the performance against South Alabama and then the performances on the other end of the spectrum where they beat Oklahoma in the last Bedlam game. So we had seen last year with Oklahoma State a ridiculously wide gap of consistent performance. Here's the good news. They found out who they were after the first 3 games. In the first 3 games, Ollie Gordon averaged 6 touches a game. Okay. Well, he went on to win the Doak Walker. They settled on Alan Bowman at quarterback. And now, heading into 24, they have 10 starters back on that side of the ball. Bowman now has not had to share reps 3 ways with the guys that were also vying for time at the quarterback spot. So Alan Bowman is a 7th-year player. He knows where he's at. He knows where he needs to improve. The improvement needs to come in ways of interceptions. Guys just had too many picks last year, 14 picks. Can't have that. When you're a run-first team and you're in a game manager role, you cannot turn the ball over with that level of regularity. They're going to feed Ollie Gordon, but we know that this guy is a workhorse. He had 100-plus yard games in 9 of their final 11 games. One of those came against Texas. He didn't go for 100 that day, but who did against the Longhorns last year? I do think the passing attack is going to take a little more pressure off Ollie Gordon this year. They bring back great weapons with Brennan Presley and Rashad Owens. They also get DeJon Stribling back from injury. He was lost last year, but going into the season, a lot of people thought he might be their number 1 guy. The offensive line returns almost entirely intact. So I'm really optimistic about what they have offensively. The big question is the defense. Can they be better in year 2 under defensive coordinator Brian Nardo? Now, they had really a different structure a couple years ago. Mike Gundy said, this is what I want to get to. Went out and found Brian Nardo at the lower levels of college football, implemented this 3-3-5, and it took a little while, particularly in the secondary. A lot of mistakes, a lot of busts, not a lot of great play in the back end. You look at the numbers. I don't need to go through the stats. They were bad. Bottom 10 in many categories. Not good whatsoever. But if you think about Oklahoma State just a couple years ago, they were one of the best teams in the country. Remember the name Jim Knowles? Jim Knowles, the defensive coordinator of Ohio State. I know a lot of people forget this, but he was at Oklahoma State before he got to Ohio State. There's a reason why he got the Ohio State job. It's because he did a heck of a job at Oklahoma State. This is not a place that has not had great defense in recent years. They've been really good on that side of the ball. So there's reason to believe they can grow significantly defensively. They have to, or else they're not going to be competing here in tier 2 as a college football playoff contender. But I really like them. I love the continuity that they have on both sides of the ball. And I think they'll be better on defense. I think the schedule sets up nicely for them as well. You got Arkansas in the non-conference. That'll be a nice test. Utah comes to them. At Kansas State, West Virginia comes to them, and they go to Colorado. If I look at where Colorado struggled last year, I think it's a pretty favorable matchup for Oklahoma State moving into the season. Move next to another team that I have in tier 2, and you're going to scratch your head. You're going to scratch your head when I tell you this one. I kind of scratch my own head when saying this out loud as well, given where this program was just a few years ago. Lance Leipold's Kansas Jayhawks are college football playoff contenders this year. If you don't believe me, look at the odds in the Big 12 to win the conference. Kansas is hovering right there, either 3rd or 4th. There's a reason why Vegas believes, and it's because you look at what Lance Leipold's done in the first 3 years. There's reason to believe this could be his best group. Now, offensively, they have a chance to be electric. They've done a great job on the recruiting trail. And if you look at some of the guys that they've brought in, these are guys that would not answer the phone from Kansas just a few years ago. Here's part of the problems. They lost Andy Kotelnicki, their offensive coordinator. He goes to Penn State. The good news is, even though you don't have the offensive staff continuity, you do have Jalen Daniels, who last year would have been in contention, not just as top-tier quarterback in the preseason Big 12 rankings, but as kind of a dark horse Heisman. This guy's electric, man. Problem is he got hurt after 3 games, and we didn't see any more of him. Jason Bean came to save the day and led them to what was a pretty nice season. They have an incredible backfield tandem, though, with Jalen Daniels and Devin Neal. Devin Neal has a chance to become one of the best players in the history of Kansas football. Might ultimately be the program's all-time leading rusher, and decided to come back because the hometown kid, even though he's already gone over 3,000 career rushing yards. The receiver trio, all back. Offensive line should be solid. Defense is elite in the secondary in some ways. Really, really good. The problem is they lost a bunch of guys up front defensively, and that's not an easy place to recruit because everybody wants a portal guy to come in and play defensive line. So going to have to establish themselves in the front 7 where they had a ton of turnover, but the back end should be able to keep them in a lot of games because they have some elite players there at corner and at safety. The setup, I think, is pretty good. Now, remember, they play all their home games in Kansas City this year for the most part. Okay, they got renovations going on in their home stadiums. So they're in Arrowhead. They're in other places around Kansas City. So it's not like every single game is going to be in the friendly confines of the home field. But I look at their schedule, and I think it sets up okay for them. You get TCU at your place. You go to Illinois. You go to West Virginia. You go to Kansas State. You got Iowa State at home. You got Colorado at home. I think the schedule is manageable for Kansas. And if you look at last year's performances, man, they were in the mix in a lot of good games. And I think this team has a chance to be very, very solid. They're going to have electric speed, a ton of speed. It's just, will they be good enough in the front 7 defensively in a league that I imagine gets a little more ground and pound with the addition of Utah and with what's already been established in the league as what wins. Let's go next to the tier 3 teams. Tier 3, these are qualified as the spoilers. There's not as many of these here in tier 3. Spoiler, to me, floor is 8 wins. So a team that's really good could spoil seasons, but probably not quite good enough to get to the college football playoff. So I qualify these teams as spoilers. Floor is 8 wins, but should be very, very solid. We'll start with Arizona. And remember, if Arizona were in the Big 12 last year and they won the Big 12, they would have made the college football playoff and had a first round bye. So that was last year. Here's the problem. Now they've had some turnover and they have a new coach, and there are a couple question marks. You had unexpected roster turnover when you thought that Jedd Fisch was going to be the guy back as the head coach. You thought things were setting up really nicely for Arizona to be that dark horse playoff contending, maybe even a national championship contending team. Yeah, that all went out the wayside when Jedd Fisch took the Washington job. The good news is you were able to retain the skill set of Noah Fifita and his top wide receiver, Tetairoa McMillan. So you have game changers offensively. Fifita stepped in off the bench last year, was amazing against Stanford, and played really poised beyond his years, gave him a chance against SC, rattled off 7 straight wins, 5 against ranked teams. They did a lot of good things under his leadership. The coaching change will make things a little bit difficult. They did lose some key pieces defensively. They did lose a dynamic starter at running back, but the schedule is not unbearable. They're at Kansas State. They have Utah on the road as well. Texas Tech comes to them. Colorado comes to them. West Virginia comes to them, and they go to UCF. That UCF game will be very tricky. That's why I think Arizona maybe comes back a little bit. Wish the Jedd Fisch would have stayed, because I think had he stayed, it's no slight towards Brett Brennan, he would have had more continuity to build on what was created last year as a foundation. But the turnover just threw too many wrenches into the equation, so it's hard to totally be on board with Arizona at the moment. Let's go next to West Virginia, Tier 3 team. They are a spoiler, massive roller coaster last year. 9 wins, amazing. Bowl win, incredible. Great wins over the newcomers to the Big 12, but also losing to former head coach Dana Holgorsen on a Hail Mary, losing to Oklahoma State and allowing nearly 300 yards rushing. So there were some ups and downs, but for all intents and purposes, it was a really good year for Neil Brown, partly because he found a 3-headed monster offensively. Garrett Green at quarterback, really dynamic. Can expect him to continue to grow as a passer. I actually think he's going to grow a lot. I think he's got a really nice release. I think there's a lot more in the tank there as a passer. But we know he can run it, had nearly 800 yards rushing last year. You look at the offensive side, though, he's not the do it himself. CJ Donaldson, he's your bell cow, hammer, big body, physical runner. And Jaheim White, undersized, but my goodness, is he dangerous in the open field. He posted the nation's highest per carry average of all running backs last year, averaged nearly 8 yards per carry, 7.7. So that 1-2 punch will be super difficult to defend. And then you factor in that Garrett Green can also exploit you with his legs. This offense might be very tricky to contain. You look at some of the guys defensively, they did lose a lot. Okay, they lost a bunch of guys. A handful went pro. A few transferred out to become starters at other places. They went and added guys from the FCS. They went and added guys from the G5. But either way, it's not ideal with the amount of turnover that they had defensively. The schedule is also challenging, one of the toughest in the Big 12. You have Penn State in the non-conference. That's a tough game. We all know that. Penn State top 7, top 8 team in the country coming into the season. Great opportunity, I might add. If West Virginia can get that one, man, woo, feather in the cap. That's huge for the Big 12. So not just West Virginia fans, the entire Big 12 contingent needs to be rooting for West Virginia there, because that might be the biggest non-conference game on the schedule for the entire league. Then they go to Pitt, backyard brawl. Got them last year at home. Now they have to travel to them. Kansas comes to them. They go to Oklahoma State. The difficult 2-game stretch there. Iowa State at home. Kansas State at home. At Arizona, which is a really tough trip all the way across country to Tucson, UCF, and then at Texas Tech. I think the schedule is brutal. I really do for West Virginia. I love the team. I just think the schedule's too tough, which is why I put them in the spoiler category right now. And then finally, tier number 3, spoiler, this year is UCF. Now, the transition was challenging. If you look at UCF last year, but they weren't the only ones. BYU, Cincy, Houston, they all struggled. Okay, they all struggled moving to the Power 5, But if you look at UCF, they were in position to have a much better season than they did. If they could just hold leads in the second half of games, things would look really different for a team that finished in bowl eligibility but didn't have the season that a lot of people had hoped. 5 of their league games, they jumped out to a massive lead before blowing it. Okay. 4 times that lead was double digits. Okay. And 4 times those leads were blown after halftime. So fortifying the strength, having depth, all those things are hugely important for Gus Malzahn moving into year number 2 in the Big 12. They went out and they got KJ Jefferson, big physical runner, really, really solid with the ball in his hands, over 2,000 career rushing yards, will lower a shoulder, will run with power, will be useful in short yardage. That's massive. But I do want to see him be a little less streaky as a passer. The career touchdown interception ratio is great, 45-9. That's awesome. I just want him to not have as many misses when he doesn't have his A game. That has happened at times, and you do see his performance and consistency level up and then drop off from time to time. The skill positions are back. Top 3 weapons are all back. Malzahn took over play calling duty, so you think the offense is going to continue to roll. And then the defense, last year, the biggest problem is they just weren't good against the run. And they really struggled against the run, giving nearly 200 yards rushing per game. That's one of the worst in the country. So Gus Malzahn goes out. He hires Ted Roof, who has been around college football for a really long time. Was a part of a national championship winning team at Auburn with Malzahn, and recently helped a lot with Oklahoma's defense and allowing them to progress as well. So Ted Roof has always been stout against the run. I would anticipate that for UCF again this year. The schedule, not terrible. At TCU, Colorado, at Florida. Of course, the Florida game, massive for UCF to get to go to the Gators and take them on there in the swamp. At Iowa State, Arizona's at home, at West Virginia, and then Utah. The schedule's tough for sure, but hopefully UCF is more well-equipped to handle it compared to where they were a year ago. All right, moving forward, these teams are bowl teams. This is tier 4 in the Big 12. Bowl teams meaning the ceiling's probably around 8 wins, but I fully expect to see them in the postseason. We'll start with Iowa State. Last year, tricky spot. Rocco Beck gets inserted into the starting lineup, have a ton of players back. Beck, I think, did a really nice job en route to being named the Big 12 Freshman of the Year. Now, you look at Abu Sama, who had nearly 300 yards in the Snowmageddon game, was an incredible performance. And John Haycock is back as the defensive coordinator. They really had just about everybody back. So if you want returning production, if you want guys that have played a lot of football together and have had moderately good results, Iowa State is a team that you should probably get on board with. Now, I am a little bit more hesitant because I think the schedule is really tough. And I also think that things have strengthened around Iowa State in the Big 12. But I look at where they're at, and they could have a breakthrough season. This is one that I'm very high on them, even though I have them in tier 4. I think their ceiling has a chance to shoot them up to tier 3 really quickly. But right now, I'm going to take a little bit of a wait and see approach. I'll make a decision on them really after the Iowa game. That's when we'll find out. At West Virginia, UCF, at Iowa, like I referenced, Texas Tech comes to them, at Kansas, at Utah, and Kansas State. Play a lot of really good teams on that schedule. So I think Iowa State, if they can get 7, maybe 8, that'd be an incredible year. That's why they are right now in tier number 4. TCU is also in tier number 4, settled in on Josh Hoover at quarterback, started the final 6 games. The big thing, I think, last year, they tried to insert a bunch of transfers, but that just didn't materialize. But TCU is kind of due for a bounce back year. If you look at where they were last year, they were 0-4 in one-score games, were terrible as relates to turnovers. Their defense really struggled. They gave up a lot of freebies underneath and gave up a ton of catch and runs. They bring in Andy Avalos defensively, who's going to implement a 4-man front, an aggressive, get-after-you mindset. Did a good job at Oregon back in 2019 and 2020, and did a decent job at times as the head coach at Boise State. So, looking at where things are for Andy Avalos, I think he steps into a really good spot. The problem is TCU's schedule is brutal. I think they have 5 games against the top 6 teams. I do think they have a chance to be better, but I'm not sure they quite get into the point in which they're tier 3 right now as a spoiler. I think the ceiling for them is about 8 wins, And that would be a heck of a bounce back year for TCU, given what they were last year. UCF at SMU, 2 tough games, but 2 games that can certainly be won. At Kansas, at Utah, Texas Tech comes to them, Oklahoma State comes to them, and Arizona comes to them as well. So those are some of the notable games there for the Horned Frogs. Another one, Texas Tech. Texas Tech is in Tier 4. Really good recruiter is what we've seen from Joey McGuire. The buy-in around Lubbock is outstanding, but the problem is the results on the field have been a little bit up and down. Like, we were super high on them last year. It never materialized, but that's okay. We'll see where they go this year. Maybe this is the year flying under the radar a little bit to make some noise in a Big 12 that looks a little different than it has in the past. Baron Morton's now the full-time starter at quarterback. Hopefully he's at 100%. Had a shoulder injury last year. Kind of struggled times. Some of the velocity on the ball, the downfield passing attack wasn't great. They just couldn't create a lot of big plays. The good news is they have an elite running back in Taj Brooks. Tons of production last year. Tons. Went for 1,500 yards. Everybody started to acknowledge, all right, this guy's the real deal. He's gone over 3,000 career yards, and he's 1,200 yards away from the all-time record. A lot of people wanted him. They were able to keep him at home. So hopefully they can lean on him, and Baron Morton can take some pressure off of him with a wide receiver room that is in a complete rebuild. The offensive line also going to be packed with new transfers, and the defense is a rebuild as well. So it's going to be interesting. Going to be really interesting to see where Texas Tech is at. I have them as bowl game bound, but I can't imagine they do a whole lot more than that. It's a tough road schedule too. You're on the Palouse at Washington State, at Arizona, at TCU, at Iowa State, at Oklahoma State. Then you finally get some reprieve. West Virginia comes to you. So I think they're a bowl game bound, but Texas Tech, it's going to be hard for them to elevate beyond Tier 4 at the moment. Next is Colorado. Colorado, I do believe, is bowl game bound this year. Now, Dion has flipped the roster again. You think back last year, 72 signees, the number 1 ranked transfer class, retaining just 10 scholarship players from the previous regime. Everybody watched them. The problem is they kind of fell off a cliff after what was a really impressive start to the season at 3-0. Now, here's the problem. The offensive line was a huge issue. The defense was a disaster. They got blown out by Stanford. One of the worst, not blown out. They got blown out in the second half against Stanford after putting together a 29-0 lead. They finished 4-8, and they were last in the Pac-12. 45 of those 72 players for Colorado that Dion brought in last year are already gone. So a lot of turnover. Here's the good news. Shedeur Sanders is always going to give you a chance. All right? He is always going to put you in position to go out and potentially steal one. If everyone else on the offense doesn't play well, he has enough juice and game to be able to elevate all those other players to potentially secure a victory against a better roster. That's how good he is. Having an elite quarterback is the ultimate neutralizer, and I believe Shedeur Sanders is elite. Needs to be better in the pocket, though. Took way too many sacks. And while the offensive line was disastrous in many ways. Guys, they gave up 52 sacks. Okay? It's not good. We know it's not good. I think Shedeur can help them out occasionally if he can just get the ball out of his hands just a little bit quicker. They are deep at wide receiver. Okay, you bring back Travis Hunter, who was outstanding last year, playing both sides of the ball. 700 yards, 57 balls caught, missed some time there in the middle of the season. Jimmy Horn is back. Omarion Miller showed some potential at times. 200 yards against USC, so maybe he can build on that performance. And the transfer of Will Shepherd from Vanderbilt is significant. Had 2,000 plus yards and 21 touchdowns playing against great competition on a weekly basis in the Southeastern Conference. The entire offensive line, the liability that was last year, is gone. All right, 10 spots in the O-line too deep, only 2 guys are back. That's probably a good thing, considering how much of a liability it was. And the guys that they went out and brought in are guys that have Power 5 experience. You go out and get a guy from Indiana. You get a guy from Houston. You bring in the number 1 rated offensive lineman in the 2024 recruiting class as well at left tackle, so he can probably play right away. That's all really beneficial, and I think the turnover at that position group in particular was necessary. Let's go next to the defensive side. Robert Livingston, He's the new defensive coordinator. Going to be tough for him to elevate this defense based on where they were last year. They had another massive haul in the transfer portal, and they addressed some of the question marks that they had along the defensive front. That was the biggest issue. The defensive line was not capable of playing at a crazy high level last year. They just weren't. So they go out, they add a couple of great pieces, a couple of blue chip prospects, a couple from Pitt, a couple from other places that might be able to jump on that defensive line and elevate that group immediately. I do think they've done a pretty good job this year in the portal addressing some of the concerns from last year. The problem is the league that they're moving into is all about the offensive and defensive lines. Think about some of the teams that they're going to be facing. And we'll go to the schedule here in a moment. Even when you get North Dakota State in week 1, North Dakota State's going to try to pound the football. Nebraska on the road, pound the football. UCF, Gus Malzahn, they want to pound the football. Kansas State, they want to run it like crazy. Cincinnati, even at times, probably going to try to run it. Texas Tech, we just talked a moment ago about their running back. All right, their running back went for over 1,500 yards last year. They are going to pound the football. Utah can pound it. Kansas is absolutely going to try to run the ball, not pound it as much, but live with speed. And Oklahoma State has the Doak Walker Award winner at running back. So the schedule is extremely difficult. And the matchups for Colorado are something that I don't yet feel great about. I expect them to be improved, but this is a see it to believe it business. I anticipate strides taken, and I do anticipate them getting to the postseason, but making a ton of noise in the Big 12, that is a bridge too far at this moment. Let's go next to Tier 5. And these are programs that are work in progress, okay? Work in progress. We'll start with BYU. The big thing with BYU is things look pretty good early. Beat Arkansas, beat Cincinnati, got Texas Tech after a 5-turnover performance. Even the Kansas game, there was a moment where you felt like they had a chance. Gave a couple defensive scores, and next thing you know, it was over. They had chances against Oklahoma State. They had a bunch of chances last year. You bring in Gary Bohannon as the quarterback. They went to that well last year with Keaton Slovis and was mixed results. That quarterback competition is ongoing. Really, to sum things up, to get to the postseason this year would be massive progress for BYU. They just need to get deeper. They need to get bigger. They need to be more capable of weathering the storm in the Big 12. Next will be Houston. Now, I love Willie Fritz. Guy has proven over the course of time that he can build a program. We also know that Houston can go right out in their backyard and recruit some of the best players in the country. We saw that during the Tom Herman era. The problem is they're not very good right now. The offensive and defensive lines both need to be replaced. They're experiencing transition from a philosophy standpoint. So you look at the Big 12, and I don't think there's a team right now that I feel less confident about, frankly. I think Houston's a huge question mark, but I'm a believer in Fritz, so I think the future will be bright for Houston, just not bright here in 24. Arizona State, Kenny Dillingham, he stepped into a complete disaster. Whether it's the NCAA investigation, the previous regime was a problem, okay? Self-imposed bowl game ban, ton of transfers. It's just been a problem, all right? Massive, massive problem. So this is going to be a pretty significant rebuild, and it's going to take some time. Tons of newcomers last year, 78 newcomers on the roster. So a lot of guys that are kind of playing together for the first time. I do like the hire of Marcus Arroyo, who has had some success coordinating at Oregon. Their offenses really average 35-plus points per game. I think they have a back to build around in Cam Skattebo. He's one of the more exciting players that you probably don't know a whole lot about. So you look at kind of where they're at, and they are certainly right now. If they get to a bowl game this year, that would be an outstanding job by Kenny Dillingham and his staff. Couple more before we put a bow on it. Baylor, Dave Aranda, to think where this team was just a couple years ago at Baylor, Big 12 champs, Sugar Bowl victory, 12-win season. Well, since then, things have not gone according to plan. They're 3-13 in their last 16 games, and they really need to figure things out. New offensive and defensive coordinators. Jake Spavital is in from Cal, knows the terrain, has been successful in the past. And then defensively, feels like you're basically going to get Dave Aranda calling the plays. All right. The thing about it right now is you got to figure out the quarterback spot. Sawyer Robertson's taken on DeQuan Finn. DeQuan Finn's a transfer from Toledo. Finn was the MAC MVP. A lot of athleticism, had over 500 yards rushing, 2,600 yards passing, 22 touchdowns, and 7 scores on the ground. So very optimistic about what Finn could provide in the event in which the offense around him isn't quite as good. But that quarterback competition is going to determine a lot about what Baylor might be capable of doing this year. And then finally, the Cincinnati Bearcats. Now, you look at the transition, everybody struggled. BYU, Houston, Cincy, and UCF, they all struggled. But here's the good things. The things that they did well last year, for the most part, are back. Okay? They did a good job running the football. Like, we know that. All right? They are rock solid running the football. We know that Corey Kiner went for 100 yards 6+ times, had over 1,000 yards last year. He's back. The entire offensive line is back. So some of the things they did well are back. Problem is, they got to figure out some situations on defense. They were good up front. Other than that, it's kind of up and down. And I do think the schedule is pretty manageable. All right. The schedule is more manageable. So I do think it's possible Cincinnati, if they kind of align everything and improve on some of the areas where they were deficient, could get to the postseason. But at this point, it's tough to kind of predict because of just how up and down they were at times on both sides of the ball. Moving into our mailbag, and we always appreciate everyone that's been sending in tons of awesome questions. We're going to get to them. I promise. Just keep sending them in. If you have questions about your team, specifics about your team, maybe a question about the big picture college football, would love to answer them here in our mailbag. Always collegefootball@gmail.com. You can also submit them to the show on our social media platforms at alwayscfb on both Instagram and on Twitter. Goobs, where are we going?
All right. First question today comes from Sean in Cape Cod. He asks, after all the conversation and back and forth, do you see any way that Florida State and Clemson stay in the ACC until 2036?
Now, the question, and I hate to use lawyers speak here, but I feel like I'm kind of guarding against this a bit. I think there is absolutely a possibility, but I think it's extremely unlikely. Now, Florida State has already been very outspoken about their wanting to get out, their willingness to get out, their possibility of exploring other avenues. But I don't know for sure that their lawyers are going to find a loophole. And I don't know for sure that Florida State's going to be able to come up with the money to pay to get out of their grant of rights. And I also don't know that if they do get out, they're going to have a home. So if I'm Florida State, like, I need to know with certainty that the grass is greener on the other side. I don't know that for sure. Both the Big Ten and the SEC have said, yeah, we're not really super enthusiastic about adding Florida State. Both have said that. So that leaves you with one option, and that is the Big 12. And the Big 12 ultimately might be a very lucrative move, but I don't know that as of this moment. So is Florida State better off going to the Big 12, or are they better off staying put in the ACC, or in the rare event they go independent, who's going to schedule them? You're not going to play ACC teams. Are the Big 10 teams going to say, yeah, we'll play Florida State? You know what they'll say? They'll say, all right, well, Florida State can come to us because we're not going to Tallahassee, but if you want to come to us, we'll play you. So I think that's something that you need to take into account as well. So if I had to put the percentage likelihood that they're in the ACC in 2036, I'd say it's 5 to 10%, but still a chance.
That's fair. By the way, that's how Bobby Bowden built Florida State into that powerhouse. It was anyone, anytime, anywhere. Maybe they take that approach again. Next one comes from Jack in Dallas, and he asks, if Ohio State doesn't win the national championship, or at least play for one, is Ryan Day in danger of getting labeled as overrated?
He's already being labeled that by some. And I think it's a little backwards. And don't get me wrong, we all know that every game's weighted differently. No one's going to try to sit here and tell you that the Michigan game is the same level of importance to Ohio State fans as a game against Maryland. No one's going to try to compare the two. No one's going to sit there and say, well, yeah, you lost to Michigan, but hey, you know what? You beat Iowa, so you're good with us. Like, Michigan game means more. So he has to beat Michigan. really more than anything else. But I don't know how you can ever call a coach overrated when he has 8 losses and we can name them off the top of our head. Like when you can name the guy's losses in 5 or 6 years, you know the guy's doing pretty well. All right, he's lost to Michigan 3 times. I get it. That's tough. He's also lost in a national championship game to Alabama. He lost in a semifinal game to Clemson. He lost in another semifinal game to Georgia. He lost to Oregon in the game in Columbus, which was a while back. And I'm blanking on one other game, but the guy hasn't lost very many games. I think he's lost 8 in his career as a head coach. So, no, he's not overrated. Just people are frustrated because he did not beat Michigan the last 3 times out. It's fair. It's understandable. But the guy's not overrated.
All right, and last question today comes from Vince in Dallas. And he asks, do you think with the 12-team playoff, fans will be more or less interested in college football in November than in years past?
This year, people will be more interested. It's new. It's different. Nobody really knows how teams are going to be weighted at season's end. We don't have precedent on our side. So this year, there will be a massive ramp up in interest amongst fan bases in college football in November. I also think, too, there's a lot of fan bases that have never been in position to make the playoff. I mean, we've talked about teams all year that might knock down the door and make the playoff for the first time, whether it's Utah or Kansas or Miami or, I mean, other teams that have been great, sure, in some cases elite, but they haven't made the playoff. So I do think that there's going to be a lot more interest universally in college football in November because everyone's going to be fascinated with how the playoff works out. And you're going to have 20 teams that have never been there before that if they just take care of business in November, they have a real chance of getting there to the 12-team format. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Continue to appreciate all the support that you guys have shown the show, so much so that the fact that we get to go on ESPN2 for an hour tonight is amazing. We hope you enjoyed the show. We hope you watched the show on ESPN2. And if you're here with us via the ESPN YouTube channel, hit that thumbs up. You can download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Our podcast downloads continue to go up. Very, very excited about the progress we're making on that front. So appreciate all of you that are spreading the word about Always College Football. We don't have some massive marketing budget. Like we don't go out and promote like it's me, Jack, Coobs, and Jake pretty much every day. And that's pretty much it. So we don't have, a bunch of people pushing the content. You guys are those people. And we very much appreciate how you guys have supported the show over the last couple years. So for all of us here at Always College Football, thank you. Tune in today on ESPN2. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.